you so much. I'm so excited for tonight. And this is our second one, our second Media Literacy Week special. And I am so excited for our two guests that we have here tonight. And of course, all of you, we make you turn your cameras on because, as I always say, you're also the special guests. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you after I have a Q&A with our first two guests. So I want to introduce them first, and then we're going to get into Q&A, and then I'm going to open up the panel discussion to everyone else, because I know that every person in this Zoom room tonight has amazing lessons and ideas and also questions surrounding the topic of media literacy. So first of all, I am so excited to introduce Frances Wong. She is a journalist, essayist, speaker, activist, and poet focused on issues of diversity, race, culture, and the arts. Wong is the child of immigrants. She was born in Los Angeles, raised in Silicon Valley, and now divides her time between Michigan and the big island of Hawaii, which sounds amazing. She's worked in philosophy, ethnic new media, anthropology, international development, nonprofits, and small business startups. And her writing has appeared in a host of media outlets, many with an Asian American focus. She actually co-created a multimedia network for the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center Indian American Heritage Project Online, which is amazing, and a traveling art exhibition to go along with it. She's the 2019 Knight Arts Challenge Detroit winner, Marguerite Casey Foundation Equal Voice Journalism Fellow on Poverty, and Keith Center for Civil Rights Detroit Equity Action Lab Race and Justice Reporting Fellow on Arts and Culture. And let me be honest with you, the list goes on and on, but then I take away the whole hour that we have with Frances. So I'm just so excited to have you. We also have Liz Ramos, who's always has been a frequent guest and contributor to these amazing educator Zooms that we host. She is a U.S. history teacher at Alta Loma High School in California. She was awarded the Inland Empire Council for the Social Studies Teacher of Excellence for exploring ways to integrate technology into her classroom. She has participated in international video conferences with students, involved them in creating documentaries, digital storytelling, blogging, and so much more, also a powerhouse. And I could also go on and on about Liz as well. But I think you're here for the Q&A, right? You can read more about them online. So I'm going to start off with some questions that I have for Frances. And we always have a really active chat. So as we're talking, feel free to throw in questions that you have or ideas that percolate based on the discussion that I'm having with Frances, and then we'll have with Liz. So first of all, Frances, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I can't even imagine how busy your schedule is. So we really all appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about media literacy and your incredible career. So yes, it's Media Literacy Week. And as I listed above, you've worked in pretty much every field possible in media, and I'm sure there's more to come. I want to start kind of with your origin story. So what attracted you to journalism in the first place, Frances?
I'm always surprised when people say they like to see the wide variety of things that I've done, because sometimes in my, Michigan winters are very long. So in the middle of winter, late at night, I'm like, oh my God, I just can't keep down a job. What's wrong with me? But I've always appreciated when people see it as a good thing. So I guess we'll start in terms of, if you want to talk about origin stories, right? The first piece that I published, I was in 4th grade for Highlights magazine. It was a book review. I earned $5 for it. I was very excited. And then I had a great 7th grade creative writing teacher, a great 8th grade drama teacher, and then I competed in high school speech and debate all through high school. And with speech and debate, I competed in events like impromptu and extemporaneous speaking. So that meant I was practicing all the time. I basically wrote 3 speeches, in a day, right? In before school, at lunchtime, and then after school, just to practice. And those were the impromptu speeches, right? You just make them up. So it's like writing an essay, but in your head, right? So basically I wrote 3 essays a day, every day for 4 years. And so everything I learned about writing, I learned in high school speech and debate, honestly. And I went to graduate school in philosophy, and one of my professors, very famous crotchety old professor, said, "Why are you in academics? Because you can actually write, right? People are in academics because they can't write, but you can write." And I was like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And so a couple more twists and turns later, I found myself looking for work with a little baby. And I had all these questions. I had all these questions about how to raise children of color, and how to raise them with culture and pride and language. And there was nothing out there. There was no literature out there. And so I went looking for it, and then I started writing it. And so all that literature, I wrote a lot of it, but unfortunately it's for online media. So a lot of it doesn't exist anymore. But anyway, so that's how I started.
That's awesome. Yeah, there's always like the way back machine, but yeah, I don't know. It's hard to find stuff on there. Maybe I need to work on that. But that's so interesting. So connected to that, and the question for everyone tonight was that Vicky asked to frame this conversation was thinking about the first moment in history that they remember the reporting and that struck them. And so my question for you connected to that is, like, was there an event in history that informed your decision to become a journalist, like something specific? And then also would love to hear your take on the reporting that you were seeing as an up and coming journalist that kind of informed the way you covered the way you covered events, or might have made you decide to cover them a little differently.
Oh, great. Those are the two questions I was hoping for. So when I was in high school, there was an article that came. I was very naive. Okay, it's just I'm very innocent, very naive. My kids say I'm still very innocent, but I was competing in speech and debate. I read Time, Newsweek every week. I watched the McNeil-Lehrer report every week, but I just accepted all of it. I really believed that if it was published, it had to be true. Otherwise, why would they publish it, right? Especially in a book, even more so, right? But if it was published, it had to be true. And there was this article that came out in Time magazine about Asian Americans. And it was the first time I'd ever seen Asian Americans, written about anywhere. And it said that Asian Americans are good scientists and engineers, but not good leaders, right? The model minority myth, and there's a whole history behind that, but I didn't know that history then. So I showed it to my dad, and I was talking to my dad. I said, "Hey, look, it says Asian Americans are good scientists and engineers and not good leaders." And my dad, who's an electrical engineer, he just looked at me and said, "China has a 4,000-year history. Who do you think was leading it?" And that was like the biggest aha moment of my life. And to realize that what is published isn't necessarily true, and that you have to think, think past that. And that also kind of that was a big aha moment. And then in terms of how a big news event that affected how I cover news is there was Wenho Lee was a scientist at Los Alamos, and he was accused of espionage for China, and he was put into solitary confinement for 9 months. And it was it was a big case. But when it happened, it didn't make sense to me, because he was an immigrant from Taiwan, and they were accusing him of spying for China. And if you know anything about Taiwan and China, which obviously people back then did not know, you would know that someone from Taiwan is the least likely person to spy for China. And then the other piece of evidence that people pointed to, that the news media pointed to, was his wife was born in China, but then immigrated to Taiwan. And then I was like, well, someone from China who immigrated to Taiwan in that time period is even less likely to spy for China. And then I think there was another piece that he and these other people, graduated from Taiwan University. I was like, there's only one university there, right? Or one good university, right? It's like the Harvard of Taiwan. So being, graduating from there doesn't show anything. And so New York Times was the first one on this story, and I read New York Times, and I read every single newspaper in the country, and then international. Then I started reading internationally, because I thought I must be missing something, right? This doesn't make sense to me. I must be missing something. They must know something. There must be some piece of evidence that people know, that the journalists know. Otherwise, why would they say he's a spy? That's crazy. That's ludicrous. And so I read every single newspaper around the world. I remember I was up all night. I read around the world. Nothing. They just repeated the same facts, and there was no reason why was he a suspect other than that he was, ethnically Chinese. And then in the end, right, after 9 months solitary confinement, the judge apologized to him. He was, fully exonerated, and he actually got a $1.6 million settlement from the federal government and 5 media organizations, and I believe New York Times is one of them. Wow. So that was a really big kind of, and also because a lot of Chinese Americans of that generation, including my dad, were engineers and scientists. And so, he looked like any one of my uncles, any one of the Chinese school dads, to stereotype broadly, but, it could have been any one of us.
It's a lot of times an interest in something starts off somewhat local and personal, and then next thing you know, you're covering so many other topics beyond that. Now, thank you so much for sharing that story. It's so fascinating. So my next question has to do with your new role. Well, not your new role, but the fact that you are PBS NewsHour's. Well, yeah, you're one of PBS Hour's
new.
Brand new. Yeah. I was like, is it brand? Because I was like, how brand? It's pretty brand new, right? So
yeah.
But you just started out
2 months.
And 2 months. Oh, yeah. So it's 2 months is, I've lost all sense of time lately. Yeah. So I'm looking at the months and I'm like, oh, wait, that was the summer. Okay. So the time space continuum really doesn't exist much after being in this remote world. Like, what is time? Mm-hmm. Right. So you are brand new in this position. So everyone's, I'm leaving everyone hanging. So you're one of PBS NewsHour Extra's new community correspondents. So I would love for you to share with us about this role, and also why. I mean, I think you're in a room full of people who already agree with this, but just break it down for anyone who's watching later, why it's important to continue reporting at the local and community level.
Mm-hmm. So this is like a huge, amazing opportunity, and it's a great, the community's initiative is so amazing. I couldn't believe it when I first heard about it. So it's what basically the idea behind the community's initiative, to put it bluntly, is, there's a lot of news coverage on the coast, East Coast, West Coast, and PBS NewsHour does a lot of Washington, DC. But what's going on with the rest of the country? And what's going on with, how should we say, communities that are not normally covered? That includes communities of color, but also just communities that are in other places, right? If the journalists only stay on the coast, they don't even know what's happening in the rest of the country, or they don't have the ability to understand and interpret what's happening, right? Like the Wenho Lee case, right? If you don't know the difference between China and Taiwan, you're going to make mistakes. And so same with this project there. And so we have journalists stationed in Fresno, St. Louis, New Orleans, Dearborn, Detroit, and our editor is originally from Detroit, but now currently based in New York. And so we're covering these communities, right? They're not your normal communities, right? If you think, oh, they want a Midwest reporter, you think they would go to Chicago, right? The big cities, but again, they're trying to get away from the big cities and look at interesting cities with really, particular demographics. This is the beauty of it. And so we have people who are based in these cities and understand these cities. And yes, someone just posted Detroit versus everybody. Yes, you need someone who understands that. in Detroit, one of the criticisms often is, these out-of-town reporters, they parachute in to town, and then they look around, they say, oh, this is terrible, and then that's the story that they tell, and they just miss the beauty and the joy and the culture and the creativity that comes along with these places. And so for me, because I'm covering Dearborn, this is a city that is the largest concentration of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans outside of the Middle East. It's in Dearborn, Michigan, and it has a long history stretching back to the 1800s. And it's not just, the Arab American, it's an Arab American community. It's not just Muslims, but it's Muslims and Christians. And then the Muslims are not just Arab American, but they're African American and Bangladeshi Americans and Arab American. So it's a mix, but you need someone who understands that complexity of it. And so we've had great fun. I've written about the Arab American National Museum. I've written about the Dearborn mayor race. The next month, there's a very strong possibility that Dearborn will have its first Arab American mayor, first Muslim American mayor, in 100 years of history. What else have I written? But then also, and I've been covering the Arab American and Muslim American communities basically, since 9/11. My specialty, as it were, is writing about Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. I've written about these communities all my life, or all my writing life, and I added, and then after 9/11. I saw the parallels, I saw the connections. So I started writing about Arab American communities, Muslim American communities, and Sikh American communities. And I recently wrote this very nice big piece about the Sikh American community and their stories of activism. And so
interesting. And that's so important. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us the importance of really having local reporters report on what's going on in these regions. You're right. People airlift themselves in. You're right. Look around, think they understand Detroit, and they don't. Right. Right. Not at all. Right. And I think if we want to move forward as a nation, we need to have a better understanding. And that comes from this local and community reporting. A lot of it does. So speaking of Michigan, you taught a course on Asian Pacific Islander American media at the University of Michigan, which sounds like an amazing course. I wish I could have taken it, maybe one day. Can you tell us more about that course and the role that media literacy, which is understanding how to evaluate and make media, plays in it, which I think that our entire country should have a course on that right now. Mm-hmm. Would love to hear about that from you.
Yeah, well, this is a really fun course because you're talking about, you have all sorts of visual images. I mean, for students, it's really accessible because you're watching films, you're looking at movie stars, and then you talk about the history that underlies that and why things are the way they are. So in the course that I teach, and actually I do like 1 hour, public lectures on the same, but I talk very fast. So we start with the silent film era, and we look at Sesue Hayakawa and Anna Mae Wong. Now, Sesue Hayakawa was like the highest paid film star at the time, 1900, and he was like the first, what do they call it? The first heartthrob of the silver screen, because he was these sultry eyes, gorgeous man. And then, he would have, anyways. So we start there, right? And then we go through time and we look at how a lot of these actors and actresses have played the same roles, stereotype roles. You've got the dragon lady, you've got the evil villain, Fu Manchu, you've got the kung fu expert. And then when you get towards the 80s, then you have the nerd, and then you have the geek, and then and then let's see, 80s, and then you have also, and anyways, but the stereotypes get repeated, and they're very they're blunt, they're not clever, they make mistakes, historical mistakes, where if you know history, you sit there, well, this is just me, probably other people don't do this. It's like, that doesn't make sense because, you know, and I'll go through the whole history of it, but it doesn't make sense. But you see how over and over again, you know, like Asian males are stereotyped as kind of nerdy and sexless, and then Asian women are very, you know, these sexual beings, you know, these dragon ladies, and they kind of go back and forth. But then there are real life ramifications for young Asian Americans who are growing up in this society, who are trying to go on a date that is not really weird. And you know, I watched a documentary when I was in college, and all of a sudden it's like about this. And it was like, oh, that's why people are so weird to me. Oh my gosh, that's what they see when they look at me. I couldn't, you know, it was like, because I didn't know those stereotypes, because I never watched those old films. I just watched, you know, what was, you know, in my era. And so anyway, so in the film, we kind of go through the history of the stereotypes, and we see over and over again how it is repeated. And then we come to the present day and we look at Asian American actors and filmmakers and how they are subverting those stereotypes and creating new images and you know, really having fun with it. Like Harold and Kumar is fun. You know, I haven't taught this since then, but you know, Crazy Rich Asians would definitely be on the next version, and Shang-Chi, and Fresh Off the Boat, right? Where people are creating new stories. And when you talk about how you're creating new stories, this also gives Asian American students more options to think of themselves as creative beings, because again, to stereotype broadly, as the child of immigrants, your immigrant parents want you to be safe, secure, be able to support yourself. And that nobody wants you to be an artist, right? I'm an artist. I don't even want my children to be artists. So I'm very happy all my children are scientists. But right, that's kind of the thing. So that's the kind of the arc of the course, and we have a lot of fun. And then we talk about history too, in a very painless way.
That's awesome. That sounds incredible. And it's so
and
important.
I show lots of shirtless Jason Momoa photos too.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to audit that class now. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. You sold me. No, because I think about growing up. I grew up so I'm Gen X. So I grew up watching those John Hughes movies in the 80s. I don't even want to name the character that was portrayed in one of those John Hughes movies. And it just, that was like that 1980s trope about Asian men that, you know, it was so gross watching, but then in retrospect, it's even more disgusting. So I'm glad that you have a course that unpacks that and talks about, you know, why that's so important that we open up how we portray all people in this country and the world. So I want to open up the conversation to Liz, and then we're going to open up the conversation to the whole group. And then I want to hear your take on this too, Frances. So my question for Liz and then Frances, and then maybe everyone watching who teaches this, is just so Liz, thanks so much for joining us tonight. And so my question for you is just like, do you have some really like best practices in terms of teaching media literacy, helping students, you know, figure out what's high quality journalism versus, well, let's be nice, not so high quality journalism. So do you have some tips for us tonight, what you do with your students? Walk us through that, and then we'll go back to Frances.
Yeah, so one of the things that we'll do in class is we'll have a conversation, and I generally start out the year with Checkology and going through some of that stuff. And then we talk about the fact that you want to look at journalism and that's following journalistic standards. And we have a discussion about news organizations that are following journalistic standards and other news sites where it's maybe not necessarily grounded in journalism. People where they take stories, repurpose them, and the like. And we also talk about lateral searching, like let's find and verify the facts. And so one of the lessons on a different PBS project I have worked on, we do this lesson called Mediocrity. And we go to 3 different news outlets, and we're going to look at what's going on the homepage. What do they see as the lead? And what are some different headlines on the politics page? And we'll do that for 3 different news outlets. And I say, okay, pick one topic on there, and I want you to read it from those 3 different news organizations. What is similar? What is different? What what does that tell you about things? And so we kind of like babysitting that as to like laterally see things on that, but then research outside and corroborate. And telling them that you want to do something like that. Like when you see something pop on your social media, don't just like retweet it. Like put the keywords. Are you seeing reputable news organizations report that story? If not, hold back and figure it out. Laterally search and this and that. And you might want to question where that's going. And then one of the other things that we do is this the time where I can bring in journalism in action?
It's
Or
bring it
wait.
in. Yeah.
Okay.
And I love
So I'm going to quickly go to, oh goodness, which one is this? I think, no, this one. Here we are. PBS Journalism in Action. And so Sid's on this Zoom, and she was also one of the curriculum writers. But we have a whole series of lessons where we look at the role of media in history and how journalism has been used to bring forward the stories, enlighten the public, serve as that watchdog, informing the public, and how we've had people be challenging the status quo and breaking down the walls, and what we say in my class, getting into the good trouble on that. So one of the pieces I was one of my favorites. I am biased. I wrote this one, but I love the muckraker one and the World War II women one. And in the World War II women one, we take a look at how women they weren't just staying at the home front of Rosie River. That's lovely that they were at home. You know, we had everybody doing their part, but we also have some information about Therese Boney, who is breaking down barriers, a photojournalist, capturing what was going on in the camps, the children and adults, going on what they call truth raids. And her work helped leading to United Nations with establishment of UNICEF. Martha Gellin, who was the first solo female reporter on D-Day, covering what was going on. A lot of people don't know that. Mary Craig, who defied the rules when they said, no, military planes and ships, only males. She went on there and covered things, breaking barriers with the US Senate galleries as well. And with Eleanor Roosevelt, with establishing the first all-female press conference. And it said that she was helping to get the Civil Rights Act of 64 to also include women in there. And so just being a trailblazer on that. Toni Frisell, fashion photographer, who then turns her camera on capturing the diversity. She took one of those iconic photographs of the Tuskegee Airmen. And so this goes through talking about all these different things. And a lot of the kids, I think the most iconic photo that the kids will recognize is the Tuskegee Airmen, but the intersectionality of our diversity and people breaking down barriers and coming through. So in this interactive, we have a bunch of different activities, primary sources where teachers have the opportunity to help students see how media has helped to bring to light different stories and conditions that have gone on in the United States, whether it's this one with World War II. I also love the one on muckrakers and talking about muckrakers. And then I talk about our local muckrakers here in the Inland Empire and the connection of the pools, desegregating the pools in San Bernardino County, and how the lawyer that worked on that then goes on to work in Sylvia Mendez, who works with Thurgood Marshall, who goes on to Brown versus Board of Education. And the kids never knew a thread of that case started out here in the Inland Empire, and just some other stories in there. And I just recently came upon on Twitter, SS Chats did a conversation among the Radium girls. And I never knew who they were. I felt like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. But I found some interesting stories. I'm definitely bringing it in. There's an interesting BuzzFeed article that kind of breaks down for teachers to get some background information. I love this. BuzzFeed has a 20-minute video on that I think I'm going to use with my AP kiddos. If somebody's looking for a smaller condensed one, Glow has this like video animated, but then media, mass media and the environment leading for change. And so I found this part of a journal article where they talk about how the Radium Girls and their story, but also how the media helped bring it forward and lead to changes and on OSHA and different things that we have. So I think it's important to highlight with students the stories in history, but how also does the media help us amplify that? And where else can you corroborate this? And these are historical thinking skills and media literacy skills that we have. And then with NAMLY, they have a different topic for each day of this week. Access is defined how, where, when, and how often people access the tools that they are necessary to thrive. Analyzing the content of media, asking questions about a piece of media in order to identify authorship, credibility, purpose, technique, and economics. And I think that also goes with analyzing who those reporters are. Are they the local reporters? And I try to bring a lot of local history and not just look at national politics, but also look at what's going on in our state and our community with our kiddos here in class. Evaluate, drawing one's own judgment, reacting, stopping back from your reaction, media messages, and the like, and then creating. And that's what that great connection to PBS's journalism in action, because the kids are going to be having an opportunity to create like a newspaper head or something. And then teachers who are taking informed action and doing the C3 inquiry arc, or schools where they might have like a civic literacy seal. Are kids taking some action? How can they get out there? How can maybe their local school or they take some action to bring awareness to something going on in their community, or a PSA for media literacy skills within their school, their community, their parents, and the like. So
cool.
That's a lot of information. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
but
no, it's great. Yeah, I'm
there's
glad we have it all.
ways that teachers can do that.
And I'm glad we have it all recorded so that people who've been watching, and other people can, and people who have not been watching can watch us later and get the sources. But I think Vicky's sharing them in the chat. Let's open this up now. I'm like excited. Now I want to figure out ways to work this into my curriculum like tomorrow. The chat is really, really lively. And I've seen a lot of really good points. Mark Newton asks a really good question for tonight, especially, and I'm going to pull him up if he doesn't mind asking his question about how do we know, I just lost it. How do we know that journalism is legitimate? Can you ask that question? And I would love to hear from Francis and then Liz on that.
Yeah. Oh, Mark, you're muted.
Yeah.
How many times have we said that this year?
You just wanted us to
Right?
say it again for old times.
I know it.
Yeah, the good old days.
It reaffirms I'm alive, right? So how do we know that journalism is legitimate? What are some traits or characteristics of quality journalism so that we can share those with our kids? And how do we then separate that from propaganda? It's one thing to say Fox News is not journalism. It's another to say that the New York Times maybe is, but how do we know? And how do we know that specifically for the types of people or the kinds of people, the journalists who are creating that? So what separates a journalist from an opinion person and so forth? So just some of those questions.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important when you're trying to figure out who is it. Hold on one second. Dee Dee, can you turn that down? My teenager just came home. So so it's important to look who is speaking, right? Or who is writing. And I think it's good to take some time to kind of vet the main sources, right? So mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, PBS NewsHour, NPR, there's certain standards, right? And they adhere to those standards. And so, but if you're not sure, double check their reporting. If they say, oh, the president said such and such, did he? Well, go look it up. You can watch, so sometimes when I'm not sure about a source or some news item, because these last few years have really been wild in terms of in terms of the news, right? And so how can I put this? So previously, right, before the previous administration, you know, if a federal agency or the White House says something and it's published on their website, I'm like, okay, well, that's true. I can just use that. That's their official position. And then over the last 4 years, I have found that I had to fact check everything, right? And see, is this true? Is this not true? Did that person really say that? Or is someone paraphrasing it incorrectly? Or, you know, and so PBS NewsHour has this great feature where they live stream important events all the time. So, you know, when the president has a press conference, if Dr. Fauci has a press conference, when Simone Biles and the gymnasts in the U.S. on the U.S. Olympic team testified in front of Congress, right? There was a live stream. You could see them, you know, doing it. And if you couldn't do it because it's in the middle of the day, you can catch up on it at night. Or you can just look for that one soundbite that everyone is talking about, and you say, well, and decide for yourself. Did they really say that? Were they implying something else? Are they being misinterpreted? So there's a lot that you can do by yourself. I know nobody has time, but since you don't have time, once you figure out who your reliable sources are, then you can take shortcuts, right? But sometimes you need to see it yourself and decide. And then in terms of culture and race, I think that's like a sub issue. It's important to know, right? So sometimes I'll look at the author of the articles, like, does this person really know what they're saying? You know, do they have an academic background? Do they have an ethnic background? Because not everyone, let's say, of a particular ethnic group knows everything about their ethnic group and history. And someone of a different ethnic group doesn't necessarily know nothing. But those are things to consider when you're interpreting, right? When you're trying to decide, is this someone legitimate or not? So for a fun example, a few years ago, there was a woman who wrote an article about how when she got married, she made a vow that she was going to stay hot for her husband. And then this, of course, women everywhere exploded and went crazy and said, this is terrible. And there were like 3 days of all these, you know, reaction pieces. And after like 3 days, it was revealed that this woman had only been married 2 or 3 months. And then after that, everyone just laughs like, oh, you have no idea what is coming. And then it just kind of turned into something else. But I think if people had known at the beginning that she had only been married for 2 months, no one would have taken her seriously from the beginning.
Right. Context is key. I'm a history teacher and we always talk about context, but context is key in every sense, right? That was really helpful. And some people are throwing in some great sites to use. And I keep hearing from both Frances and Liz, this whole idea of this whole strategy of lateral reading. And Sid gave a shout out to Sam Weinberg, who writes quite a lot about that. That's his method, so to speak. And yeah, it's so important to teach kids about lateral reading, especially when they are, listen, our students, our young people know how to have many tabs open on, you know, whether it's on their laptops, their phones. I see them in class. So they kind of naturally can do that. Whereas like, it's something that we need to train people a little older. But I think we're all kind of on that after being home for 18 months on computers, we're all just have tabs open everywhere. Right. But I think it's so important to teach them that method. Yeah. Sam Weinberg from Stanford. And he was one of the advisors on Journalism in Action, which is amazing. That's awesome. Would love to have, yeah.
Can I go real quick? Yeah. I also put in the link in there in the chat for museums. Is it fair lesson? And I'll do that with the students and looking at language, I think, and sometimes my kids will be like, is this English class? I'm all, well, a little bit. Like you can't separate like ELA and those skills when you're looking at history and news literacy. And they have a lesson where you're looking at the wording of titles and some information. And I always tell the students, like, pay attention to the word choices that are being used and how things are framed and how that's an important part for media literacy and figuring out is something propaganda is bad. How do you know if it's propaganda or journalism? And so I think something like that. And then there's that mediocrity lesson I posted in the chat. And then the News Literacy Project has a lesson called Info Zones, where you zone information. Is this meant to persuade you? Is this propaganda? Is this satire? And helping kids understand the motive behind something, and with looking at those language skills, is also important.
Yeah, thank you. That's so important. I would love for Mary Ellen to jump in, because I mean, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is that some teachers probably in this chat might be teaching in states with these new, I like to call them anti-history laws, or truth banning, teaching truth banning laws. They like to call them CRT. It's not what that is. No one teaches that. But I think that it's important that we do address the fact that we do have school boards and parents very interested in what we're teaching. And Mary Ellen brings up something in the chat that she had to defend PBS, an iCivics lesson that she recently did to a parent. So I'd love to,
Well,
I'm a little confused, but I am a lot lately. So.
well, I actually had this wonderful opportunity where PBS is going to come in and film me teaching some iCivics, which is great. And we were all excited, and my boss said yes, and everyone said yes. And I sent out a letter to all my parents with the release, and I got back one parent who just like was, he said, "Oh, I put the iCivics motto in the letter because I thought, oh, this says, you know, we're trying to have equitable, nonpartisan, da 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 da." And I thought, that's great. Every parent will be happy to see that. And he said, "Well, I saw equitable, and I thought that was a alarm bell, that it was like." I don't remember if he said critical race theory or what, but he said, you know, something about, we don't need to say equitable because we've already become equitable or something. I don't know. And I just like sighed, and I wrote a very diplomatic letter, and I said, and he was telling me that Sandra Day O'Connor was not exactly nonpartisan, and PBS is not exactly nonpartisan. And I just did my usual very diplomatic response. And, you know, he said he thanked me for my response, and said he'd let his daughter do it. And, you know, thank you for the response. But I was just like, ah,
My head just exploded 700 times.
I know.
Like I went
not
through
had
every
that
stage
much,
of head
though.
explosion.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, at least he's allowing them to come in and film, and you get to teach this lesson. Yeah. So, wow. Okay. Yes. 750 times. Yes. Maybe 800. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the backdrop. And that's why media literacies and teaching it to young people is more important than ever, because we have, unfortunately, some parents who, I'm going to just say this, might need some media literacy lessons themselves. And I'm not trying to sound rude or obnoxious, but I mean, that is one example of that. So, yeah. Definition of media literacy. Would love to hear how, like, from some teachers in the room, how you would define it and how you teach it to your students. Any teachers want to share how they teach about media literacy or how they define it for their kids?
Well, I just will pop in real quick that I did
Oh.
a great webinar here, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was about media literacy, and it had a thing about share or beware. And I thought, wow, that is such a fun idea. So I started using it as a bell ringer, and my kids love it. And it was so, like, my little heart went pitter pat, because they were like asking all these great questions and saying, I don't know, I don't think I trusted, that's not a verified user, I think we should check and see if blah 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 in another tab. And I was just like, yay. So that was cool.
I love that. Share or beware. That's so important. I like that you're teaching them about going past the tag of verified user and what that actually means, right? Because it doesn't always mean what it says it means, what you think it means, rather. Tim, you bring up a really great question. It's something that my students often ask, because we say that, and there's this whole thing about looking for reliable sources. That's going to be on the new New York State Regents exam, looking for reliability, which is awesome. But I've definitely had students say to me, well, there's no unbiased sources. So how do you address that in your class, Tim, or attempt to?
So my students are just starting to do research papers and stuff. So I have my camera off. I'm helping with math homework and all that stuff. But I tell them it's like trying to sell a used car to somebody. So you have to prove to me, you have to come at me with as much resources, as much credibility as you possibly can. And I said, me as a cisgendered white male, Philly Catholic parent with kids, like I see the world in a certain way. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think sometimes we can go too far in saying that we need to find unbiased sources. And I think it's really important to let the kids know that we're all biased, and that's okay. And, if we're doing research on, like we were talking about, martinlutherking.org, which of course is put up by Stormfront, and it checks all the balances or all the checklist for why it's a credible source. It's recently updated, it's multimedia, it has all these types of things, and it's a .org. And then we dig a little bit deeper and, oh, okay, so now I see what they're trying to do. But we can use something like that as a resource if we're doing research on white power groups. And so we kind of need to talk about all those types of things. But I think a lot of times we do a disservice that there's this magical, unbiased, 100% reliable resource that's out there, and we can frustrate our kids when they can't find that. And so I think I don't have any magic worksheet or any magic thing. It's more about having those conversations about, okay, why do you think this is credible? And it can take 3 days to find 5 credible sources, and that's okay. And I try to get across to kids, that's probably more important than the research paper itself, right?
Oh, I agree, especially in today's landscape. Grant, you mentioned something a minute ago about about being able to figure out what your definition of media literacy. Can you share that with us a bit?
There we go. Found it. What did I say? I did a typo when I did it too. I said, I think of being able to identify what real news is and being able to identify what the spin is, but also like looking at whose story is being told and whose is not. I think that was just, I feel like that's something I learned in undergrad, but in some of my classes there, but I don't know, just that pretty much.
Yeah, I love that about like looking at whose story is being told and whose isn't. And that goes back to how we framed today with the conversation with Francis about the news item. I want to go back to you. I want to hear your thoughts on all this. The news item you shared with us in the beginning about Taiwan and how if you knew anything about the geopolitics, the way that case was panning out was not. They just had no sense of what was going on in the region. So would love for you to jump in and share with us your thoughts on all this talk about there's no unbiased sources and the struggle that young people and their teachers are having with helping them, guiding them through finding reputable sources.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I do think that we are all biased in particular ways, but it's an important part of as we've been talking about bias over these more recent years, it's important to kind of understand what your personal biases are, right? And once you understand that, then you can compensate for them. And part of understanding what your bias might be is reading, being really well read and trying to understand the points of view of other people. And so reading books and novels and films by and about communities of color, African Americans, Asian Americans, etc. You can see their point of view, right? And it's not just one point of view, right? That's kind of the difficulty some of these films have, is that since there's so few films, that this one film has to be it for everybody, and it has to represent everybody, and it has to show everyone in a good light. And one film, one actor can't do that. But if you can watch 10 films, then you can say, oh, so there's this kind of character, there's this kind of, wow, Asian Americans are just like normal people. There's all different kinds of them, right? But you won't get, this is, you may not see that if you never know anybody, or if you never see them on TV, or, you know what I mean? So this is part of the process of us to kind of understand who we are and where our limitations are. So for example, I have certain limitations, and we all do because of age. And so I often ask my kids, like, hey, is this is this normal? Is this cool? Is this, what do you think about this? And then I get, their point of view, and then I can see what it looks like to, someone who's a teenager or someone who's a young adult. But then the reason I ask my kids as opposed to any random kids is I know my kids, I trust them. And so I think we do the same with sources. Like if we don't understand, I have, favorite writers, and these are individual people of different ethnic groups that I like. And if there's a subject or a topic that I'm not really sure about, I'll go check and see what they say about it. And then I'll think about that, I'll follow their line of argument. And then if there's someone I trust, I'm more inclined to believe what they say. Or rather, it helps me make my own decision.
That's a great suggestion to give to kids as well. Like have their little, I guess, toolkit of trusted sources that they can always go to, who they know are verified sources, not ones that, Twitter, Instagram tell you are verified. So you should follow them. And we're having a really interesting little side conversation related to what you're talking about, Francis, in the chat about social media. Sid shared this statistic that I've seen for a while and want to believe isn't true in some ways, that 62% of people get let's emphasize 62% of Americans get their news from social media. And then obviously we all know the problematic the problematic implications of that. Although Tim brings up a really good point that he says, let's not completely discount social media either. So I know we're heading towards our 8 o'clock closing hour, but I think I guess the last question I want to ask Francis, Liz, and anyone in the room, tips on helping our young people navigate social media, because whether we like it or not, I know my students come to me every day with something they learned on TikTok, not Facebook, not Instagram, TikTok or Snapchat, but definitely TikTok, right? So, and I don't want to necessarily discount, because they send me some TikToks and then I look up whatever the person was teaching them about, and it's actually accurate. So any tips on how to help young people navigate where they're getting news? Because I don't want to discourage them from going on TikTok and learning, but I think what they need is some guidance there. So any tips on how to help them, kind of, maybe it's some lateral tips about how to go from TikTok to just making sure what you just learned is actually correct. Liz or Francis or Liz? Yeah.
I think it goes back to, again, like the idea of lateral searching. Even somebody you trust, somebody could get something wrong. We just need to teach our kids to verify. Verify, do some lateral searching and figure out what's going on.
Right.
And that's one thing I love about that mediocrity lesson, is that's what the kids are doing. Like don't just go to one website, news organization, go to multiple. What is the similar? What are maybe some different things that are coming out on something? And then maybe do a little lateral search to verify, corroborate on that. That's
great advice. And I'm going to say that the past couple of days, my students were working on a project online, and this is really simple advice. Sit down with them, because if they're doing the project in class, just, socially distanced, but sit down next to them and just watch their process. I found it fascinating because, and Tim made me think of this, because Tim mentioned that, Google also gives a biased search result. So young people don't see ad next to, and not just young people, a lot of us miss that it says ad, right? Or it's like, it's an ad. They were looking up like Marbury versus Madison, and then it took them to like a conservative site, let's say. They're not necessarily aware of what's happening. So I just sat there and watched them search, and then gently guided them and said, well, how about this site, this? And then I explained to them why, because I think sometimes it's just a matter of watching their thought process, seeing where they're going, why that site's catching their eye. It's usually because it's the top of the list or it sounds familiar, and then go from there. They know about algorithms. They know all about that and sponsored content when it comes to like TikTok and Instagram, but I think they do trust Google a little too much. So I think it's important to guide them I found it fascinating, to be honest, to just watch them go through the sites. They literally just click on the first thing that comes up, and then they were starting to cut and paste it to put in a slide. I'm like, what, have you read it? They haven't even read that. So then they stopped and they went back and read it. Francis, any tips for us on how to help kids navigate the somewhat interesting and facts that they get on TikTok that are sometimes correct, but sometimes not?
Well, this is kind of a different take on it, but the power of social media has shown us that that a lot of times the trusted authorities who we should trust don't always tell the truth. So, for example, violence against African Americans and violence against Asian Americans have always happened throughout our whole history. It goes back hundreds of years. But a lot of times when someone says it, it's like, no, but that can't be possible because the police officer said such and such, the judge said such and such, and they're supposed to be, trusted authorities. But now that people have cell phones and they're recording it, a lot of other people, are seeing it and realizing, oh, right. And they can, on one hand, they can evaluate with their own eyes, and then they can realize that this is really happening. And then they can make the next step. Well, these are the ones that we can see. What about the ones that we can't see? And then, that helps them think about who do we trust in terms of, authorities and what is really going on. So that is, yeah.
That's great. That's helpful. Thank you so much. So I don't know if you see Sid in the chat, who actually gave us that alarming stat. Sid's actually one of the curriculum writers on the Journalism and Action website. And I'd love to just hear some of your thoughts tonight, Sid, as one of our esteemed curriculum writers.
Well, I don't know how many of you have ever heard Sam Weinberg. Raise your hand if you ever heard him or saw his stuff. Okay. It turns out that the best of us aren't very good at this yet. And, you'd think Stanford students, Stanford professors, they would immediately recognize something that was fake news, but they don't. So we shouldn't feel that we can do a perfect job yet. It's very difficult. I know that. It even works left. I don't know how many times I've corrected on Instagram or Facebook that statement that GI Bill was not available to Black veterans. That is not true. It was. They couldn't use it. So we have to do what everybody's been saying, the good old Sam Weinberg lateral. Just look, who is saying this? What else have you found online that these people have said? His example is some sort of a pediatrician's website that you think is legitimate, and when you see whatever else they've written, it turns out they're crackpots. So, it's very difficult to do. We shouldn't feel like we can do it perfectly. I think if I were to name someone who's doing it the best possible way, it's Liz. Liz is a techie expert, and she can get kids there. The only thing is, I'm sure she'll tell you, it's an uphill battle. It really is difficult.
Thank you. And I was just scanning my bookcase because I definitely have that book from Sam Weinberg. I recommend it to everyone. If you can put if anyone remembers the title of that book, put in the chat. If not, we'll share it with you later. So, oh wow, this is what always happens. We run over because we get so into the topic. And tonight has been incredible. And I really want to thank everyone who's participated tonight and joined us. I wanted to get just quick, and then I'll let you all go, because I know even though the teachers are now back in the classroom, we're still looking at screens a lot, right? So I want to help you get off your screens for a little bit tonight. But I'd love to get final thoughts from Liz, just quick final thoughts from Liz and Francis, and then I'll toss it back to Vicki and we'll wrap up. So Liz, final thoughts on the conversation tonight, and then Francis.
I want to say thank you for all the comments and resources that other people have been sharing in the chat. And it's sad. And I know it's not one here. It's not a one and done. We have to keep repeating, especially as social media evolves, and it's just repeating with our kids and modeling and doing things. Like my kids will ask me a question and I'll quickly hop on where they can see my screen on here and do a quick lateral search. And let's figure this out. And so I think we need a model. We need to repeat, 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 and just keep learning ourselves, because things are going to continue to change in this media ecosystem that we're living in.
Yes, just like repetition, like in any type of practice, repetition's key. And that's why teachers have, that's why we do it. We're so patient. We have to be patient because we keep having to repeat this stuff and adapt with the times. Frances, final thoughts on tonight.
Yeah, well, thank you all for doing what you do. I'm the daughter of a second grade teacher and have a complete awe of teachers. I don't know how you do it. I could never do it. College students are much easier, honestly. But I have an article coming up in a few weeks about how to teach children of color about, you know, hard topics like 9/11 and the Afghan refugee situation, especially if it might affect them in direct or indirect ways. How do you do this? But I talked to teachers and I talked to researchers, and they were amazing. And one of the teachers told me about how he takes like the idea of terrorism, because we were talking about 9/11. He was talking about 9/11. He's like the idea of terrorism and says it's not new and here. And then he told me about the worst school bombing in American history, and it took place, you know, in Bath, Michigan, you know, our state, in the 1800s, I think, late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, but it was a historical event. And so he was able to tie all these history events with current events back and forth, back and forth. And then he's taking the kids to the polls on election day to go and do exit polling. And I was like, that is so amazing that you can make these connections. And thank you all for doing this. It's difficult work, but important work.
Thank you for all you do, Frances. And I'm really looking forward to that piece because it's something that I struggle with as a teacher, history teacher, walking my students who are primarily BIPOC through the story of America. And I think just saying trigger warnings sometimes isn't enough. So it's also how we present the material. So I'm really looking forward to that piece. Thank you for writing it. And Liz, thank you so much for all you do. You inspire me every time I hear about how you teach. And everyone was saying, and Sid was saying you were a tech genius, and it's no coincidence that your handle is History Techie, right? So yeah, and everyone, speaking of handles, please put your social media handles in the chat so we can follow each other if we don't already, because as you heard, I met Vicky on Twitter. So that's where I live when I'm not in the classroom. And so thank you everyone for joining. We will definitely have another educator Zoom soon, but this is a super special one for Media Literacy Week. And I'm going to toss it back to Vicky. And once again, thanks for having me as your host. And thanks for everyone joining us and for this like just incredible discussion, both in the chat here and also in our Zoom conversation.